Thanks, Spencer. Good morning. Before we begin, I just want to thank all of you that were able to see the email this past week from Debbie about my daughter Hope, who had knee surgery. And so thank you so much for praying for her. She is recovering well, and she's getting better every single day, which is great, and finally was able to get up and move around yesterday, and so we're really grateful for that. So thank you so much for your prayers. If you don't know who I am the senior pastor here at this church. It feels like I haven't been here all summer. Because I haven't been. I have missed a lot with you and been all over the place. And we talked a little bit about our Jamaica team that was away. We had our annual conference in Ohio. I was on 2 vacations, and then we were last week at the Alive Music Festival. And so just here, there, and everywhere. And I just want to say that I'm excited to be back together with you. It has been a month since I preached. And, you know, as pastors, as preachers, we kind of get this itch to preach. And so I'm a little itchy today, little itchy. As you know, our Sunday school classes have been studying the book of Galatians, and they have been a part of something that we call our Summer Bible Reading Challenge. And each summer they choose and select a book of the Bible, and they study it for the whole summer. And at the end of the summer, they have a challenge between the youth and students and the adults. And they do like a Bible quiz at the end to see who knows that book of the Bible best. And strangely enough, you would think that naturally the adults would probably be dominant in that, but it's actually not true. It's pretty even. Sometimes the adults win, sometimes the kids win. And so that will be taking place here the end of August. And so since they're in the midst of that study, we wanted to be a part of that study also. And so for 9 weeks, we're already on week 4. I feel like this is my first week, but we are already on week 4. And for 9 weeks, we're going to be studying the book of Galatians. We're calling it Free at Last, that Paul talks to the Galatians and naturally to us about this idea of freedom, that we used to be slaves. And today we're going to entitle it From Slave to Free. And you'll see where that fits in a little bit. For the last few weeks, Travis and Pastor Morris and Spencer have been unpacking chapters 1 through 3 and a little tiny bit of chapter 4. And so for those last 4 weeks, we are understanding and learning that this letter that Paul wrote to Galatians, the Galatians are a group of people. They make up churches from a region called Galatia. Everybody say Galatia. This is not one single church. These are multiple churches that are in a town. It's kind of like if someone that was a superhero in the faith wrote a church to the churches in Latrobe, that would be multiple churches. It wouldn't just be our church, it would be all the churches in Latrobe. And so Paul wrote this letter to these churches in this region called Galatia because there was a group of people that had come into this region and were starting to spread some false teaching. They were leading these churches and these church members astray and causing them to believe some things that were improper and untrue. And so Paul writes this as a response to the way that the Galatians, these churches in Galatia, had been responding to these Judaizers that had come into their region. So we've seen over the last few weeks how Paul has been absolutely adamant with these church members about the difference between following the Mosaic law, which is the Old Testament law, and the difference between placing our faith in Jesus. These churches that were in Galatia were getting confused and misled, and they're being forced into believing that they need to return back to practices of the Old Testament law, that they need to conform to these Old Testament Jewish laws. And so what I really, really appreciate about our preaching team is how great they did in relating this to our own practices of faith and reminding us that it is not through our own works that we receive salvation, but it is only through the work of Jesus. That it is Jesus that sets us free, not our own work, our own effort. We have those of us that have accepted Christ as our Savior, trust Jesus alone for our salvation, and through him the work has already been done. And so God is pleased with us, what we've learned, because not of our own work, but because of his Son and what his Son has done. So what I want to do today is continue in this letter. Thankfully, Spencer, you can tell I'm starting to lose my voice, and so Spencer jumped in there and read all of Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 to 31 for us. And I just want us to just understand some of that stuff as you just listen to him read, and as you're reading along, you might be saying to yourself, what in the world is he talking about? The book of Galatians is complicated. Paul describes himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. He describes himself as like this super learned guy, incredibly intelligent, and if you read through Paul's letters, you will see that too. I don't know about you, but when you talk to like super duper smart people and they talk up here, it's like, come on, talk like you're talking to a third grader so I can understand you. And that's kind of what Paul does. When Paul speaks, he speaks very intelligently, very eloquently, and a lot of times the way that he writes, we scratch our heads and say, what in the world is he talking about? And so what I want us to do, I want us to ask the Holy Spirit just to kind of help us unpack this, to help us understand what God is trying to say to us, that we can relate this to our own lives, and we can walk away today saying, oh, that's what he's talking about, and that's how it connects with me. And so what I want to do is I want to jump around a little bit in chapter 4. We're not going to necessarily just work our way straight through verses 4 through 31. We're going to bounce around a little bit. But I do want to start at that first part where Paul says this. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. Here's what I need us to understand about these people from Galatia. They are not Jewish. They are not Hebrew. They did not grow up going to Hebrew school. They did not learn the Old Testament as kids. They did not learn just like all the good Hebrew kids did when they learned all the books of the Bible, and they would start to memorize books of the Bible, and they would have so much understanding and knowledge of the Old Testament and all those stories. These people that Paul is writing to, they don't have that history. They are Gentiles, which means they're not Jews. They didn't grow up understanding all of the Mosaic law. And what Paul says to them is that you Galatians, you used to be slaves to false gods. You were serving other gods. You were engaged in other religious behavior. And so then what he does is he goes on this strong tangent and he writes a whole bunch of stuff about why are you returning back to a slavery to religion when you've been set free from it. And when we get all the way down to verse 21, what he does is he brings in a passage from Genesis chapter 16 and 17, and he talks about these two people named Hagar and Sarah. If you can remember a couple weeks ago when Pastor Morris was preaching, he talked to us in chapter 3 where Paul used an example of Abraham and how Abraham, his righteousness was accredited to him not because of his works, but by his faith. And so Paul is bringing Abraham back into the illustration. He goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 16 and 17 and tells a story about these two people, Hagar and Sarah. If you know the story, you know that Abraham is the man that God chooses to create a nation with. And he says to Abraham, when Abraham is kind of an older guy, he says, listen, Abraham, I want you to move away from your family. I want you to start over, and I'm going to make a great nation in you. I am going to just produce an incredible amount of descendants through your family. Your family line is going to go on and on and on and on and on. And he says, I want you to look up at the stars. I want you to look at the sand on the seashore. I'm going to make your descendants as the sand and as the stars. And you're going to have an incredible family. And Abraham and Sarah, his wife, they're getting older and older and older and older, and they don't have any kids. By this point, Abraham is 90 and his wife is 80 years old. Genesis chapter 16. And they haven't had any kids. I don't know about you, but I don't know any 90-year-olds and 80-year-olds that are getting pregnant. And so Sarah and Abraham start to question, is this even true? Is this going to happen? Can it be possible for us to have a kid anymore? And so Sarah says, we're going to have to take this into our own hands. God isn't showing up and figuring this out, so we're going to take it into our own hands. And so in Genesis chapter 16, she says to her husband Abraham, I want you to take my servant, Hagar. I want you to have a child with her. And this is one of those like not so pleasant things that are in the Old Testament. And so Abraham, who's supposed to be this godly man, has an affair and has a child with this slave woman, Hagar, a child that they call Ishmael. And Abraham, he's thinking to himself, well, God spoke to me, and he made this promise to me, and so because he made this promise to me, it must be my heir. It doesn't have to necessarily come through Sarah. And so this is me taking this into my own hands and saying, yep, God, this is what you said. And so I'm just kind of stepping in here and filling in the blanks. And so I'm going to help this happen. And he believes that the promise that God has to be a great nation is supposed to come through Ishmael. And then we get to Genesis chapter 16, and God says, no, that's not what I had in mind. I have a different plan. Why didn't you trust me? Why didn't you allow me? I promised you, Abraham. I told you what was going to happen. I knew that now at this point, you're 100 years old and Sarah's 90 years old, but I want to do an incredible miracle. I want everyone to know that this is a child of promise, because no one would have expected a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman to get pregnant. And so what Paul does is he takes this picture of Sarah and Hagar, of Ishmael and Isaac, of Abraham in this story, and what he does is he relates this idea of a slave woman and a free woman, Hagar and Sarah, to the Galatian people. He said, you've got this child of slavery in Ishmael, and you've got this child of freedom, this child of promise in Isaac. And he says, there are two covenants. Remember, he said there's an allegory of two covenants. The old covenant, where we're slaves to the law, and then this new covenant in Isaac, where we're children of promise. From slavery to sonship, from law to promise. And it's what Spencer talked about last week, what Pastor Morris talked about to us earlier in chapter 3, and what we're going to be talking about in chapter 4. Now, if you remember, all the way back to the first week that we started this, Travis talked to us about this group of people called the Judaizers. Everybody say Judaizers. It's probably the only time you'll ever say that word in your whole entire life. Congratulations, you got a new word. The Judaizers were the ones that came to Galatia and were trying to get the Galatian people to follow Mosaic law. They were saying to the people in Galatia, oh, you guys want to be followers of Jesus, do you? Well, if you're going to follow Jesus, you've got to follow these things too. And you've got to do this, and you've got to do that, and you've got to follow this practice, and you've got to fulfill these things, and you've got to do all of this stuff. And Paul then responds with this letter, no. That's not how we're saved. We're not made right before God by doing good things, because we check off things in our boxes, because we're obedient to the law. In fact, the law enslaves us. All the law is good for is revealing the need for God's grace through faith. He says this law puts us in prison. And so Paul, in another letter, says it is by grace you have been saved. When he wrote a letter to the Romans, he says it is by grace you have been saved through faith, not by, anybody know? Works. It is not by the good things that we do. It is by grace. This gift that is given to us through Jesus by our faith in him. And Paul is saying to these people, stop returning to slavery. He reminds the Galatians that we as followers of Jesus are not children of the slave woman Hagar, but we're children of the free woman Sarah. We're children of the promise. It's essentially like Paul was saying, stop living like a slave when you are free. Don't you know who you are? Don't forget That you're a son, you're a daughter of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. You are an heir to the kingdom. And as an heir to the kingdom, you are brought in as a son. Remember what Spencer said to us last week? We are adopted into the family. We are inheritors of the kingdom. Why would you return to slavery? And Paul is kind of looking at them like, what are you guys doing? Don't you know who you are? Don't you know who you belong to? And so going all the way back again to verses 9 and 10, Paul reminds them and says, but now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and the worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You are observing days and months and seasons and years. Now remember, these Galatian people, again, they did not grow up in a Hebrew home. They don't know the Jewish practices. And so someone's got to teach them. And so the Judaizers come in and they're saying, you've got to follow this, and you've got to follow this, and you've got to follow this, and you've got to do this and do that. And so they're learning. They're trying to understand these customs and these traditions. And so they begin to pick up these practices. And Paul says, what are you doing? Remember, whenever you were a slave to your old religion, you've been freed from that. Why would you pick up another one? You're freed from religious practices and rituals. You're saved by grace through faith. You used to be enslaved to false gods, but you're not any longer. And they hadn't gone back and started practicing their same rituals before. They weren't going back to their temples and bowing down to idols and worshiping them. They weren't engaged in those old practices of their pagan religions. What they had done was they had exchanged one religion for another. And here's the incredibly astonishing part of this passage. Look at what Paul does. He equates their following the Old Testament rules and customs with their own pagan religions that they had been delivered out of. Paul is saying to these Galatians that by trying to do the right things, by trying to pick up all of these practices and these rituals and these religious behaviors, by serving these ways, by going to these festivals, by being engaged in all of these customs, you're no different than the way you used to be. Except now you've just got a Jewish stamp on it. And so let me bring this into a contemporary language for us. It would be like Paul coming to us and saying, yeah, you go to church and you sing your songs and you pray your prayers and you study your Bible and you might go to small group and it's like if you're following through with all of these motions and by doing these things you think that you're earning favor before God. You are no different than any of these other pagan religions. Paul would say to us that if that's what we believe our Christianity is, then we are no different than the Muslim people that are showing up and going to their mosque. We are no different from the people that are Hindu that are showing up at their temple. We are no different from the Buddhist who goes to their temple. If our Christianity is checking off boxes to try and make ourselves right before God, are no different than any other religion in the world. But you might say, but Pastor Tom, but I pray. Well, I'm pretty sure that Muslims stop every single day, multiple times during the day, stop everything that they're doing, pull out their rug, and bow down and pray. Do you pray that much? You say, but Pastor Tom, I read my Bible. So do the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they probably know it better than you do. Well, I go to worship and I show up at church on Sunday morning. I don't know if you know that what Hindu monks do, but they worship 24 hours a day. Constantly engaged in worship. But I go on mission trips. Well, you might go for a week, but guess how long Mormons go? 2 years. Paul is saying to us that as long as our Christianity consists of routine and ritual that you're following week in and week out, then you are no different than any other pagan religions in the world. And just like their religions condemn them, your religion condemns you. Ouch. This is a strong picture. Because, church, the reality is that as if we're just following rules and rituals and routines, as long as we think that those are the things that are making ourselves right before God and saving us for all eternity, then we are condemned just like every other religion in the world. Paul says to the Galatians, don't you get it? You've been set free from this. You're not a slave to religion anymore. You are a son in a relationship with God. You are a daughter in an intimate relationship with God. Think about it this way. What if Satan's strategy all along has not necessarily just been to try to tempt us to do bad things, but what if his strategy is actually to try to tempt us to do good things? What if Satan's strategy really is, because the Bible says that he is a liar, that he is seeking to devour us, that he's waiting to trip us up? What if his strategy really is to try and convince you that you're good? And that by being good and doing good, that you somehow are getting a stamp from God. And each time that you put money in the offering plate, Satan says, you're doing so good. I'm so proud of you. Look at how good you are. And every time that you swerve on the road to not hit a squirrel, Satan says, oh, you're such a good person. All those other people would just run it over. You're such a good person. And what if his strategy is really to try and convince us that we're good enough? That for somehow it's up to us. And that when we show up at church on Sunday and we sing our songs, and maybe we sound a little bit better than the person beside us, you're so good. Look at the way you sing. Jesus is so proud of you. What if that's his strategy all along? That making us think and believe that by doing these things and practicing these things, that somehow we are earning favor with God. I used to, when I was in college, I had a job in the summertime working for the Derry Township Municipal Authority and the Sewage Authority. And I worked with this guy, and he was a great guy. He was probably 10 years older than me, and I really enjoyed working with him. He was my boss, and we'd drive around to different job sites and do stuff, and we would naturally have all this time to talk, and we'd be sitting in the truck, and we would talk to each other. And I was a 21-year-old kind of excited about following Jesus, very zealous person, and if you think I'm not compassionate now, you just should have seen me back then. And so he was speaking to me one day, and we were talking about faith, and he said to me about how he believes he's going to heaven. And I said, oh, that's great, because he told me that he was Catholic and he might show up at church once a year. And I was like, oh, really? Okay. And he said, I know I'm going to heaven. And I said, well, how do you know? And he said, well, because we have our Catholic festival once a year, and for that 1 week, I'm here every day setting up and tearing down. And I believe because I'm giving of that week that God's going to accept me into heaven. And I can't remember if I laughed out loud. I may have, I may not have, but I'm sure that I said, are you kidding me? You really think that your faith, your salvation is dependent on you showing up for a week to set up and tear down for a Catholic festival? That's what you think determines whether or not you will spend eternity in heaven or hell? And so then what I did was I began to talk to him about what grace really looks like and why Jesus had to die on the cross and what it looks like for us to worship through our behavior. And the reason that we do good things is because of this loving relationship that we have with our Father who loves us intimately and went to the cross for us and began to explain all that. And he looks me straight in the face and he says, my way's easier. Church, when our belief system is checking boxes and going through routines and rituals, we're no different. We're no different than the person who believes that just by doing some things that they're earning favor with God. We're no different than a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or anybody else around the world. Paul, in that section right there in verses 9 and 10, he said, but now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, and I want to stop right there. Rather, you are known by God. We might have just kind of skipped over that as we read, and we didn't really think about the implications of that. I'm known by the God of the universe. You know, I think it would be pretty cool to be known by some people. Like, there are people in my life that I look at, and I think, boy, it'd be pretty cool to be known by them. Like, if the President of the United States knew who I was, that'd be pretty cool. That'd be pretty cool if he knew who you were, or there are like some sports heroes that I have that if they knew who I was, I'd be feeling pretty good about myself. That'd be pretty cool to be known by those people. And I'm sure that there are people that you know that you are pretty much like, man, that would be really awesome if that person knew who I was. I want to tell you about Luigi. There was this guy named Luigi who lived in a small town, and Luigi was one of those guys that would sit in front of the barbershop every day, and as people would walk into town, they'd say, hey, Luigi, and Luigi would say, hey, back, and everybody in town knew who Luigi was, and Luigi knew everybody in town. And after a while, people started to talk about how Luigi knew everybody in their small town, and how crazy it was that like everybody knew who he was. And one day Luigi says, well, I don't just know everybody in our town. He's like, I know the President of the United States. And they said, no, you don't. How could you possibly know the President of the United States? He says, I do. I'm telling you, I know him. And so the town says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get your friend Giuseppe, and we're going to pay for you to go to Washington, D.C., and Giuseppe's going to be able to prove that you don't know the President of the United States. And so they get some money together, and they fly to Washington, D.C. They're standing in front of the lawn of the White House, and wouldn't you know it, the president comes out, looks across the lawn, and says, hey, Luigi, how are you doing? Giuseppe, he's just floored. I can't believe Luigi knows the president. The president of the United States knows Luigi. They come back, he tells the town, and the townspeople were amazed that Luigi could possibly know the President of the United States. Luigi says, not only do I know the President of the United States, I know the Pope. And they said, how could you possibly know the Pope? You don't know the Pope. And so he says, yes, I do. I promise. I know the Pope. He and I know each other. And they say, all right, we're putting some money together. We're flying you to Italy, and we're putting Giuseppe on the plane with you to prove that you know the Pope. And so they fly to Italy, and they're at the Vatican, and they're standing out on their veranda. And it's the day that the Pope is coming out and waving to everybody out on his veranda. And he looks across that sea of people as he's waving. He says, hey, Luigi, how are you doing? And he says, Luigi, come over here and come see me. And so Luigi goes down and makes his way through the sea of people and makes his way up to the Pope. And they're standing up there as the Pope's waving, and he's talking to Luigi. Luigi looks down and he sees his friend Giuseppe laying on the ground. And he says, Pontiff, he says, I can't stay any longer. I've got to go find out what's wrong with my friend. I've got to go down there and see him. And so he rushes down to the ground, and he sees Giuseppe laying on the ground, and he grabs Giuseppe. He says, Giuseppe, what's wrong? What's the matter? What's wrong with you, my friend Giuseppe? And Giuseppe looks up at Luigi and says, he says, I can take it that you know everyone in our town. And I can take the fact that you even know the President of the United States. And believe it or not, I can take it that you actually know the Pope. But when the guy standing next to me says, hey, who's that guy in white standing next to Luigi? That's where I draw the line. Church, we are known by the God of the universe. The God who created everything that you know and everything that you don't know, he knows you. And not only does he know you, the language here in verse 9 is actually in the Greek using an intimacy in knowing. It's not this intellectual acknowledgement, it's an intimacy. God doesn't just know you, He knows you intimately. He knows you intimately as a son and as a daughter in a relationship with him. We get a chance to walk in an intimate relationship with God. He wants a relationship with us. Not this, hey, do this and do that slave relationship, but as a son and a daughter, deeply and dearly loved. And so what Paul is doing in Galatians chapter 4 is he's reminding these people, don't you know who you are? You're no longer slaves to religion. You're sons and daughters of the King. You're princes and princesses of the kingdom. And church, the same is true for us. Religion is slavery, not salvation. You are no longer slaves to religion. You are sons and daughters of the King. God's grace is enough for your salvation. Say that with me. God's grace is enough. It's enough. You don't need to add to it. Your good works aren't adding more to your salvation. Once you are saved and you are free from your sin. It's not up to you. You know what else Paul said in Romans? And I read you part of it, but I didn't finish the verse. We are saved by grace through faith. Remember the rest? Not by works, so that no one can boast. Because it's not about you. It is not about you. You can't do it. And as often as we try, and as often as we think it is up to us, it is not. And so maybe you're here today and you're thinking to yourself, you know, after all this stuff being said, I'm not sure that I've really ever put my faith in Jesus. I don't know if I really am a Christian. Maybe I've gotten all this wrong. Maybe I've been putting my faith in myself and not Jesus. And maybe I've been thinking this was up to me. Because when we read statistics in all kinds of studies, whether it's George Barna or whoever doing studies that say that there's 60-some% people attest to being Christian in the United States and that this many people believe in God, I really worry that what those statistics are really talking about is people that have put their trust and faith in themselves, who would say, yeah, I'm a good person. And the reason that I'm going to heaven, the reason that I'm saved is because I'm a good person, because I do good things, and because I deserve it. And God is pleased with me because I do good things. And when you talk to people and you interact with other people in our world today, I hear that all the time. Yeah, I'm a good person. I mean, I helped an elderly lady across the street a couple weeks ago. I do more good things than bad things. I mean, at least I'm not like them. And we in this country have exchanged what salvation is really about, which is a gift given to us that we don't deserve. And what we've exchanged it with is this American idealism that it is up to me and that I've got to be strong and that I've got to work hard and I've got to do it. And so I need to show up at church and I need to put money in the tithe and I need to serve and I need to set up and I need to tear down and I need to read my Bible. And when I'm done with it, I can check it off and say, aren't you so proud of me, God, because I did this today? When in reality, Jesus says, why are you trying to add to the gift that I've already given you? His grace is enough. And so let it be. Let him be the one that does all the work. And we get to be children. Children of a promise. Maybe you're here today and you're like, you know what, Pastor Tom, maybe for the first time I'm realizing that I think I might have been stuck in religion. Maybe I've been a slave to religion all these years. I mean, like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years I've been thinking this way. that I've got to figure out how to do this stuff. I don't want you to leave here today without talking to someone that you trust, that you're friends with. Maybe it's one of the pastors that you talk to and say, I need to get right. Like Paul was harsh with these people and tell them to stop thinking this way. And so if you want me to, I'll yell at you today, okay? If that's okay. Stop thinking that way. You're not a slave to religion. You are a child of God who has been set free. And so, Lord, as we contemplate this, it's absolutely mind-boggling that you would offer salvation to us, yet you do it anyways. That's why it's grace. That's why it's so amazing. Because we don't deserve it. And we never could earn it. As often as we try, and as hard as we try, and as much as we think that we are pleasing you, our righteousness, your word says, is as filthy rags. No matter how hard we try, it will never be enough. And so thanks be to God that you sent your Son in our place, in our stead, to do it for us. The work has already been done on the cross. So Lord, help us to live in freedom. To live as children of the promise. To live as children who are heirs to the kingdom. You're so good that you've included us and adopted us and grafted us into your family, and we are so grateful for that. God, help us not to live like slaves, but to live like children. Thank you for your incredible grace in our lives. Help us to respond in worship. In Jesus' name we pray.